So I would also like to start by acknowledging that this is Ngunnawal land that we're meeting on, and this is a conversation that we're having. I think it's interesting to think that the Ngunnawal people have been meeting here for more than 20,000 years to have conversations, share ideas, ask questions, listen to each other, and that's exactly what we want to achieve today. So let me just start this conversation by painting a picture of where we're at. So obviously we are in a climate emergency which was declared in the ACT in 2019, and transport is a really big part of the puzzle in decarbonising our energy system. So it's important, but as far as I can see, it's challenging. It involves a lot of different pieces that need to come together, and I'm really interested to hear from the speakers today those different perspectives and how we can achieve that decarbonisation of transport. Yeah, so let's get on to that. I want to introduce the first speaker, who is my colleague Bjorn Schoenberg. He is a research leader in the battery storage and grid integration program here at the ANU, and he's engaged in lots of different projects on grid integration of renewables and electric vehicles, and he's got a really strong interest in social acceptance of new energy technology. So, welcome, Bjorn.
Thank you, Marnie, and let me also begin by adding my respects to Patricia and acknowledging this land and so I have the honour of being the first presenter today, and so I'm going to start by kind of setting the table, extending on where Marnie just took us to in terms of where we're at in terms of transport, and then I'll talk about two initiatives that I've been involved in. One's called FACTS, and then talking about integrating electric vehicles into our electricity grid, which is what Marnie and myself kind of focus on, is integrating things into the grid. As we know, we kind of want to electrify everything as a way of accelerating decarbonisation. So this is the outline I just said in a kind of presentation in 10 minutes, but in 3 parts, which I think start with as well. So as you're possibly aware, Australia has a very carbon-intensive economy. If you look at it per capita, we're one of the highest emitters globally, and the same holds for our transportation system. So this is comparing us to a range of other countries in terms of our fuel consumption. You'll see that we're the second here after the UAEs, and above Saudi Arabia, so really a distinct company in terms of consuming fossil fuels. That consumption of fossil fuels in the transport sector is not coming down. If you compare the Australian economy over this century, our general emissions or economy-wide emissions are coming down, but all of that work has really been done by the electricity system and some in land use and agriculture. You'll see that the kind of third tier here is transport, and our emissions have actually been increasing. You can also see that in this graph, which is now just our transport emissions since 1990, and the forecast here from the last federal government at least is that under their policies, or our current policies therefore, emissions are essentially going to continue at that level out to 2030, which will be no surprise to any of you is incompatible with keeping a safe climate. So that kind of sets the scene for where we're at now. Now I want to talk about the framework for an Australian Clean Transport Strategy, or FACTS, as the acronym is much simpler. So FACTS is an initiative that I was a part of with 17 other experts from the transport and... Sorry, you can't hear me?
Can't hear you very well.
Is that right? Is there another microphone?
A bit closer.
Alright, Alright. So FACTS is an initiative that was inspired by the kind of lack of both progress in decarbonising the transport sector and the lack of even a plan or the prospect of decarbonising the transport sector. So I was one of 18 experts, all independent academics from a range of universities, I forget how many now, in Australia. And we are experts from the energy sector as well as the transportation sector, and decided to develop, if not the plan for how to decarbonise the transport sector in Australia, at least a framework for how such a strategy could be brought together. And there's a focus in this on how all levels of government have a role to play and need to collaborate together with industry to achieve this. And the goal we set ourselves is to keep emissions within science-based targets for Australia, meeting its fair contributions to keeping the world within 1.5 or at most 2 degrees of warming. Throughout this is also going to be a very, very quick jump through this piece of work. And it's really there as advertising for you to look up the report, which you can get at that website down the bottom. So in terms of what climate science tells us in terms of what needs to be our decarbonisation goals and targets for the transport sector, we need to decarbonise all of land transports by 2045, and then all of the whole transport sector by 2050. We do that across a whole range of technologies, as you would imagine. And I'm just going to flick really quickly here, but I want to point out that there are some really kind of low-hanging fruit or really easy, quick things that we should be doing. And kind of government fleet vehicles and urban buses really stand out in that. That technology is readily available to go buy today, so there's no excuse for us to continue to be buying diesel buses or ICE vehicles for our government fleets. And then in the longer term, they're harder to deal with sectors such as heavy shipping, aviation, heavy trucks. The overarching message from this is that I want you to take home with, the overarching message that I want you to take home though is not that it's a matter of buying technologies today or buying technologies into the future, but having a much more holistic approach, and I'm really looking forward to our next speaker talking about how this is happening in the ACT. So the framework that we talk about is that we need to avoid unnecessary trips. Then we need to shift the modes of trips that are necessary but can be moved to public transport and active transport. And only then do we need to seek technological replacements such as through electric vehicles, electric buses, etc. You'll see there's a whole range of policy levers that we have at our disposal for each of those steps. And we can't go without saying, as often is, that COVID has shown us what we can do in this regard, particularly regarding that first point of avoiding unnecessary trips. You're never going to read this. Again, this is an advertisement. There's heaps to do, and there's heaps to do for every level of government. So please get the report and you'll be able to dive into that, particularly if you work in one of these kind of levels of government. In the last part of my talk, I want to talk more about kind of the research we're doing here at ANU, and in particular around how we integrate electric vehicles, be they cars or buses or trucks for that matter, into our electricity system. As you may well be aware, there's a risk in deploying all of these or electrifying everything, being that electrifying vehicles or space heating or whatnot. But this imposes a very large burden onto our electricity system, and it could break our electricity system, as in this figure. Now, obviously, this isn't the only thing that can break our electricity system, as we're seeing today and then the last week. But there's this kind of risk, and it's an oft-brought-out risk of, well, we can't do that quickly because it will have all these negative effects on our electricity system. In Australia, the back of the envelope number is that it could increase our electricity consumption by about a third if we were to electrify all transport, including trucks and buses. The flip side of this, though, and is something that we're working on with ActRAGL, and is on their slides as well, is that the batteries that are in or will be in all of these electric vehicles also represents a huge opportunity for the electricity grid. But again, back of the envelope is if we electrified all of our 19 million vehicles, They would have a battery capacity 10,000 times that of the quote-unquote big battery in South Australia, more than 5 times the capacity of the planned Snow 2.0 hydropower station. So this is a huge, huge opportunity now, and something that we've been working on how do we realise that opportunity. The thoughts that I want you to take home of those is actually this really neat concept that I've only heard of in the last month or so, and I did not come up with myself. It actually came from the fleet manager of the ACT vehicle fleet that we're working with in this project called REVS, together with actually ATL as well. And what that fleet manager told us is, why do we need to keep our vehicles need to be roadworthy? Is there a similar way in which we need to make them grid-worthy? So if they're going to connect to our grid and pull a significant amount of power through our grid, what kind of requirements, standards should we be imposing on them to be kind of good citizens of our electricity system? I can't give a presentation without having this one, my own thoughts in here. This is from that trial where we're using electric vehicles to provide power back into the grid to be excellent, exemplary, beneficial citizens of the grid, and they support the grid in critical times. And the point here is that the red and the blue curves follow each other very, very nicely. So technically, that's really good performance, and that's what we'd like to see. That shows what support electric vehicles can provide to the grid. That will also be a sad little last graph. The flip side of this concept of cars being grid-worthy, though, is that we also need to make our grid vehicle-worthy. So our grid currently is not designed and hasn't been conceived of as something that provides a lot of power to electric vehicles. And the last time that we've had a kind of analogous situation where we had a lot of extra load coming onto the grid was when we all installed air conditioners. And that cost us billions and billions of dollars to refit, upgrade our electricity system to service that load. Hopefully we can do a lot better at the integration of electric vehicles by making the grid smarter at how it interacts with vehicles, and as I mentioned, vehicles smarter at how they draw from the grid. This is something that's going to require standards, and importantly, it requires, I think, puts the onus on the electricity system to kind of come up with how they would like vehicles to integrate with the grid, just like the road system. We set the rules for how the standards and the rules for how we build roads, and then how vehicles drive on them. So that's all I have for this conversation. I'm looking very much forward to the questions at the end. Thank you.
Lots of really interesting things. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions about your talk. So next I would like to introduce Jo Clay, MLA. So Jo is the ACT Green's spokesperson for transport, active travel and road safety. And she's a member for Ginninderra, elected in 2020. Prior to entering politics, Jo was a Carlin accountant, a lawyer, writer and sustainability entrepreneur. And she's bringing these strands together in the Legislative Assembly with the goal to improve Canberra's planning, buses and active travel. Over to you, Jo.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. Yuma, I'd just like to acknowledge our acknowledgements. I think it's really important that we think about the first people in here, particularly when we're talking about climate change. They did a much better job than we have so far, and we need to learn and get better at it. I'm a fairly new politician. For those who don't know me, I'm Jo Clay. I'm one of the new Greens who got elected in the 2020 surge, but it took us all a bit by surprise. Before that, I've had quite a lot of different jobs. I've run a recycling company, I run a few climate change and sustainability projects. I've worked in government and out of government, and I've worked a lot in active travel. So I'm actually really, really excited to be here as our spokes on transport and planning and active travel. They're all very, very connected, and they're all a really, really big part of our climate story at the moment. We've done a bit of work. I'm on the crossbench for the Greens. I'm not a minister, so I work with the ministers to get things done. But we've actually managed to do a bit from our office. We've released a discussion paper on active travel that's prompted a lot of conversation. We'll take that forward. We've made some legislative changes from the crossbench, which was fun, that protect cyclists and pedestrians. We brought forward a bus motion because I think our buses in Canberra really aren't very good, and we need to do a lot of work on that to make it a better service. We've pushed the government to do a full park audit. There's sort of this two-strand system in Canberra where cars are important and valuable to get a lot of resourcing, and everything else doesn't. So we have all these standards that apply to roads and make sure that we spend money and maintain them. We didn't even know what condition our cars and footpaths were in. So if you're wondering why they were all cracked, it's because nobody had even done a full audit of that. We're also running a few inquiries, and we're doing one on EVs at the moment, and we'll hear a lot of interesting stuff about that. We've pushed our government on the electrification of the whole fleet. So I was quite pleased that we're running trials on electric garbage trucks, and the electrification of the buses is going slower than we'd like, but it is happening, so that's great. And we're asking a lot of questions, which in itself seems to get people to start to do things. For those who are new to Canberra, you might have noticed that we're quite a spread out city, and there's a few legacy issues when you come down to looking at things like transport. Canberra was originally meant to be a very, very small, compact city that you could walk around. It was meant to be sort of the inner north and not much else. We then in the 60s moved to this wide plan, which includes Belconnen, Gungahlin, Tuggeranong, and it's really spread out and it's very, very car focused. And that's what we have to deal with now. So where EVs you can come in and start at the start and build things the way you want to build them, we actually have to deal with the city that we have, and that is a very spread out, car-dependent city. The planners who were involved in that had some very interesting ideas that make my advisors very angry. They thought buses were welfare for poor people, they thought terrace houses and apartments were not fit for human habitation. They had some very curious ideas back in the 60s, and that's sort of where we're at. We have the biggest houses in Canberra and the smallest families, and that's going in that direction, smaller and smaller families, bigger and bigger houses. And we've got a similar footprint to Sydney, but about a tenth of the population. So we need to deal with that situation. We also need to realise that because we're so car dependent, we have growing congestion. We're growing 3 times faster than every other mainland city, and that's a problem we're not going to solve with EVs. EVs can fix a lot of things, but it's not going to do anything for congestion. Transport's huge for climate change. The tracked emissions that government is looking at, Scope 1 and Scope 2, over 60% is from transport. That's because we've done such a great job on electricity. Now that we're 100% renewable electricity, transport is now taking up a bigger and bigger share. When you look at it from a household footprint, I actually looked at this as a carbon accountant, and I looked at all your food and clothing and things that government don't currently track. Your car use is probably about 10% of your footprint if you own a car. So any way you cut it, your car use from a petrol and diesel car is massive, and you make huge savings the second you change that. I'll just mention, I've got a lot of Lego sculptors in here. I used to be a Lego sculptor. So if you have random weird images, that's why. We have in government, it's interesting, you have a lot of big questions and a lot of crises to deal with, and they're sort of piling up on top of each other. We have COVID, we have climate change, and now we have housing affordability crisis. So we've got more and more people. We need to work out where to put our people, and we really have a lot of social equity issues to think about that, as well as environmental destruction if we keep sprawling, and climate change if we keep sprawling. There's a lot of challenges to put together. We're going through a major planning review at the moment, including reviewing the entire territory plan, and that's a really good opportunity to make sure we do things a bit better than perhaps we did in the 60s. And I'm known in Parliament as the voice of doom. I constantly bang on about climate change, and my latest trick is I'm now constantly banging on about what the RPCC said in their last report, because I feel like it's a good use of my time to make sure everybody's read that in Parliament. The RPCC is interesting. They're getting more and more specific in their reports, almost as if they don't trust politicians to do their jobs properly. And they're telling us exactly what to do. So they've moved away from pure evidence science, and they're now saying, by the way, you need more infill, you need transport corridors, you need to co-locate your housing and your jobs, you need to electrify everything, and you need to support your non-motorised transport. So we know exactly what to do, and everybody is screaming at us how to do it faster. Which brings me to the bits of the picture that aren't EVs. Active travel is probably my biggest passion. I'm a cyclist. I used to work with pedal power and I ride around as my main form of transport. Cycling in Canberra is great. We talk a big game. We have some great bones to our infrastructure. Only 3% of us do it on a regular basis. We're still a tiny proportion. It could grow very fast. I actually don't consider them very bold targets. We have targets. We actually haven't moved on those targets for a very long time, which tells me that we're not putting enough resources into it. And the Greens have a lot of views on that. We know a lot of it is infrastructure, but it's not entirely infrastructure. The infrastructure is great for walking as well. You've got more like 80% of people regularly walk. Most people walk, even if they get out of their cars, they have to walk. But walking to the bus, walking to light rail, or walking to work is a major mode of transport. Everybody's using the same network, so we actually need to build it for everybody. The good news is when we build it well, it works well for everyone. It works for wheelchairs, it works for prams, it works for all of the same people. And we need to do a lot of work on things that aren't the built environment. Our speed limits, we're bringing those down in Canberra. It's interesting to see the pushback on that. Priority funding, it all comes down to, put your money where your mouth is, and we need a lot more programs to encourage all of this. We always put a gender, age and disability lens on all of this, and I am going to talk way too long, so I'll be brief, but the good news is when you build it well for anyone, you build it well for everyone, so that is a bit of good news. Public transport, again, should be great in Canberra and isn't according to the people who use it. So we've still got really low uptake of buses in Canberra, and we have a lot of views about what we need to do. I think hourly weekend services is a bare minimum, but there's actually quite a lot of work to do there. Light rail is great. Light rail is a new success story. It's a bit like EVs. You build it from the start and you can set it up exactly the way you want. Massive uptake. People love it. It is genuinely transformative. Going forwards, we're going to have both. Obviously, the light rail is the spine and the buses will feed in, and it also takes a long time. I'm in Belconnen. We're looking forward to light rail in about a decade. So it's going to take a while. The other aspect of this is, of course, we need really good public transport because not everybody can drive, not everyone can afford a car, and also, increasingly, people will lose their licences as they age or find for whatever reason that they can't drive, so we need to make sure we're looking after everybody. But of course, we have a car-dependent city in Canberra. The Greens have learned we don't attack cars. We just say, wouldn't it be great if you could go from owning 3 to 2 or 2 to 1? And that seems to be a much better journey for most people, and I think it's genuinely possible. Even swapping our cars for EVs, we are still going to have congestion. Congestion costs are massive. We also spend a massive amount on roads, and one that I'll be picking on in the media lately is Athlone Drive. We have a decreasing population down at Tuggeranong, and yet we're quite happy to spend almost $100 million duplicating a road which will simply fill up with more cars, and I would love to see that money go into buses and active transport. I think it would be a better buy, frankly. And there's a lot of interesting things. COVID was a great disruptor. COVID showed us that we can do flexible work and we can actually genuinely change our travel habits. That was really interesting. There's some new technologies and things coming in. I think e-bikes might be transformative. E-scooters are great. They're a bit expensive, but they're great. Rideshare is good. Yeah. I'm going to hurry up. So there's a lot of changing parts at the moment. I think the rising cost of petrol and diesel is a really big opportunity to help people get out of their cars and look at other modes. I think that's one of our big benefits. And then this is me and my daughter. She rides to school. We've carefully posed for a photo of her walking to school for walk to school day, but her bike's just off camera. I always bring it back to what sort of world we want to live in, and I'm very strongly motivated by climate change. And I always think about what sort of world do we want and what sort of city do we want Canberra to be in 10 years? Do we want people to be able to afford to live near their services? Do we want people to be able to get around? And we really need to make sure we keep remembering what we're after rather than just worrying what we're frightened of. Thank you.
Very fascinated by the Lego sculpture. Ask you about that later. So now I would like to introduce Dr. Yuen Phang, who is a research fellow here at the ANU with the Grand Challenge of Zero Carbon Energy for the Asia Pacific. So Dr. Phang is interested in urban sustainability and low carbon transition and urban climate and energy governance. So she's really interested in what are the most useful ways to promote electric vehicle adoption in big cities, and she's spent a lot of time looking at Shanghai. So over to you. And thank you very much, Martin, for the introduction. And today I'm going to introduce a research project conducted by myself and my colleagues on the mechanisms to promote electric vehicle adoptions in cities. And I'm also the members of ICES research clusters of both low-carbon cities and sustainable transport. So I am an urban researcher, so all my research is about how to understand the roles of cities in climate protection. So why I was so interested in cities, as you can see from this map, in the 10 major emitting economies, there are nearly 2,000 cities have made quantifiable post-2020 emission reduction commitment. This indicates that cities has a key part to play in the future climate mitigation. So in terms of electric vehicle adoption, the topic of our today's event, and 25 cities represent 32% of 2020 global electric vehicle registrations. And here you can see the 25 EV capitals here, and Shanghai is roughly sharing 4% of global stock. So in this research, we're taking Shanghai as a case study because it is ahead in the EV adoption process to give us opportunities to understand the adoption process, to observe the mechanisms underpinning the transition. So in this research, we adopt the system approach. So this approach allowed us to observe the case from multiple perspectives, for example, the physical infrastructures, economic relationships, and cultural practices. And the sustainability transition, such as the EV transition, it is a long-term and multi-dimensional process, and through which we're trying to make changes in the established socio-technical systems and shifting to the more sustainable modes. And here we emphasize the concept of contextualizations. But no matter what innovation we want to introduce to a new context, for example, introducing EVs into Canberra, it requires the reliance of actors, resources, and institutional arrangement. So this is our case study, Shanghai. By 2021, there were more than 4 million EVs on the road in the city. And this initial adoption scale is driven by a set of policies including the free number plates, rebate, tax incentives, charging incentives, and public charging infrastructure policies, etc. And we investigate the case from 3 perspectives: the policy effectiveness, the roles of peer effects, and the urban charging infrastructure. So we have done 3 scale online surveys among Shanghai citizens, including both the EV users and non-EV users, and we adopt a combination of descriptive and statistical modeling methods to do the analysis. So because of limited time, I will skip the complicated analysis and just jump to the key findings. In Shanghai, there were 2 levels of EV policies, the national level and the local level. And we found that the local level policies have played a more critical role in increasing the EV uptake, especially the locally tailored measures such as free number plates. So in Shanghai, if you want to get your number plate for your petrol car, you need to go through auctions. But if you buy EV, you can get a free plate and without auctions. So this is most important incentives to local people. And also we found that the challenges exist for the next step scale adoption. For example, people in Shanghai live in apartment buildings, so not every household has the private parking space to install private chargers. And also some buildings are too old. The circuit is too old to take actual charger. So this all creates barriers for EV users. And another example is the government subsidizes installation of public chargers, but the maintenance is the duties of the operators. And people report that many public chargers are out of order due to the low maintenance. So how the policies can address these problems, and also there are so many other the issues like this in the long-term transition. So what we can summarize here is that to enable the EV transition, it's not only about increasing
the EVs on the road. It's also about how we can create a supportive environment for the EV use in the long run. And we also calculate the critical mass of EV adoptions in Shanghai. So the critical mass is the population of early adopters. Once it reaches to a certain amount, for example, 31 to 40% in Shanghai's context, the further uptake will happen in a self-sustaining manners without any further investment. So this is the ideal situation we are pursuing in the transition. And we also found that in the initial adoption scale in Shanghai might have already triggered a trend of using EV among peoples, so creating a new social norm. However, even though Shanghai hasn't reached its critical mass yet, but even though it's approaching it, in the broader context, there are so many factors co-shaping this transition trajectories. For example, the price, the technology, the policy support, and infrastructures, etc. And what we need to do is we want to make sure these factors are supported instead of interrupting the transition process. In terms of the infrastructure, we just got our data collected in a couple of weeks ago. We're still doing the analysis, so I don't have the detailed result yet. But in this research, we're trying to understand the charging accessibilities in a comprehensive ways, not only the spatial accessibilities like the distance, also the charging price, charging technologies, and battery swapping services. And importantly, from our first round of survey last year, we found that the lower-income EV users are likely to value the EV public charger policies more than higher-income groups people. This is probably because the higher-income peoples, they have the better housing conditions, so they're easier for them to install private chargers. But the lower-income people, they may more rely on the public services. So this is indicating a potential social equity issues here. So in this research, we are using a more advanced modeling methods to investigate this topic. So the takeaways. This is a 2 years project and involving a lot of information here. To summarize, first is to enable EV adoption in cities. The changes in multiple aspects of society is required. So we need to use a system approach. And this is also a general recommendation from the recently published IPCC report. There is a separate chapters on urban climate mitigation. And second is both immediate support and long-term policy strategies are demanded for the long-term transition benefit. And the third one is engaging relevant stakeholders because we want to create EV ecosystems for the long run. So beyond the consumers, all the relevant actors should be involved and contribute. And this is also a general recommendation from the IPCC report. The last one is contextualized solutions. So I'm a researcher. So every city is different and have its specific challenges and advantages. For example, we want to introduce EVs in the Canberra context. I think we need to do some more investigations of our own case to find the tailored solutions for our community. So this is today's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yuan. All right, I'm going to introduce the last speaker, and then all of the speakers will join us for a panel. So Reid Doherty has been a consultant to government and utilities, including AGL and ActuAGL, on decarbonising transport. And he really wants to be a good ancestor by helping stop climate change. He also proudly states on his bio that he's an e-mobility rainmaker. And I'd like to know what that means exactly.
Helping countries do what I'm going to show you. Yuma, and it's a great privilege to be able to share this with you on Ngunnawal land, and I echo the acknowledgement made earlier. I was talking to Jo Clay just before we started, and she said her opinion was that the two major issues affecting the uptake of EVs were supply and cost. And supply is a problem at the moment, and hopefully it will retreat over the next year to 2 years. Although there are some techniques that we can apply to correct that at scale, and all of my talk is going to be about at scale in the short term. But what I'm going to focus on today is the issue of cost and also the integrated issue of complexity, because it's all very well getting an EV, but you need all the other bits that go with the EV, and sometimes if that's left separate, it makes things very complicated. So what I'm going to do is tackle how to get that whole ecosystem firing together. And I'm going to do it in a very numerous way, because that's the work I did for ActoAGL recently, to launch Help and Design and Conference Executives was a good idea that you saw in the first slide. And they have a product suite around the sort of issues I'm going to be talking about. So I'm going to start off with this purple patch, which is how does one convert EVs for fleet, for business, and for government fleets. I'll do consumers later. In my work with fleets over the past 7 years, what I've seen is there's an enormous gap between the financing of petrol diesel vehicles. So there's a Corolla at the top left. There's a Camry hybrid, both of those are petrol, and there's an ionic BEV on the right. And you know, if you were a fleet manager running 100 cars or 1,000 cars, you know, it would be very difficult to sell the idea that you had to spend an extra $300 or $400 a month in order to put the EV into your fleet. And it's clearly not financially rational, even if one is you know, wants to remove emissions from one's company. It's a difficult situation. It's not likely to happen. And so, from the work that I've done, interviewing literally dozens of fleets, companies, executives, fleet managers, and putting this proposition to them: if the Corolla cost you 55 cents a kilometre, if the Camry cost you 67, but the Ioniq cost you 65, would you switch? And generally the answer is yes. And there's some provisos to that. You know, is it fit for purpose? Does it, you know, carry the load it needed? You know, is it big enough for the, you know, 3 people in the back? That's what it needs. But in general, people have said, you know, if that could be achieved, we'd switch. And the good news is it can be achieved, and it is being achieved. And ActoAGL has just launched a product which will largely achieve that. Now, I'm giving a scenario here, so every vehicle is not the same, so the prices will vary. It depends on the duty cycle of the vehicle, all sorts of things. But in general, good news is that it can be achieved, and it can be achieved now. Right, let's move on to consumers. Consumers don't lease vehicles, they typically take out a personal loan, assuming they don't buy it for cash. Here again, a consumer would be faced if they did some, you know, took the purchase price of the vehicle, $32,000 for the Corolla, divided it up by, you know, the term that they wish to pay, or from the optimum term, generally people come to the conclusion it's 5 years for a variety of reasons. So I've modeled this on 5 years. And as you can see, the Ioniq BEV finishes up, you know, literally a couple of $100 more than the others. And it's discouraging. And people will look at that and say, well, you know, I might just wait for a while, or I'm not quite sure that I want to spend an extra $100 a month, etc. So that's the problem. However, if one actually analyzes that differently, and if one provides some other kind of support, one can get those prices again, where the EV is the same price as the petrol diesel vehicle largely. Again, it depends on duty cycles and how the vehicle is used, how far it drives, all sorts of things. Is that vehicle suitable for one's family or for one's personal use? All of those kind of things come into play. But fundamentally, in this scenario, it's about right. It's you know, it's the same price as the petrol diesel vehicle. And the view of all the research that I've conducted over the years has been that if one can hit this what's called price parity, but people usually think price parity is the cost of the vehicle. Well, the cost of the vehicle is $15,000 more. How's that going to stack up? Well, it does. If one actually changes the view from the cost of the vehicle to the actual cost per kilometre, which is my favourite metric, and one does the analysis, and maybe one tweaks some certain financial levers which one can tweak, one finishes up with this situation. And this is where that, by the way, in the fleet thing, I also included the cost of the charger, cost of access to public charging, and the cost of maintenance of the car, registration, CTP, tyres, you name it, is all included in those prices. Similarly here, I'm excluding the cost of maintenance, tyres and rego and CTP, as you can see at the bottom right, but I've included the cost of either petrol or electricity in the comparison, and I've included the cost of the charger. Now, if one is moving on to one's second car, one doesn't need the charger, so that price goes down further on the right-hand side. If one, for example, is living in an apartment block and doesn't want to bother with putting a charger in, most body corporates are increasingly friendly to this, but let's say one decides not to do that, one can still use public charging, because quite frankly, if you're only doing the average of 35 kilometers a day, you're probably only going to need to charge once every 2 weeks. So, you know, you can go along to a fast charge, spend 15 minutes there, you're done. So under those circumstances, the 66 cents for the EV would go down because one doesn't need a charger. But I've included it in there. I've included petrol. Now, petrol obviously is quite expensive at the moment, which has helped our equation. Electricity in the ACT is getting cheaper, which also helps the equation. But I've left out the cost of maintenance, tyres, rego, and CTP. Now, again, in the ACT, that's actually an advantage. So if we take a look at the situation in the ACT, where we include absolutely everything on both sides, one finishes up that the electric vehicle, that's including a charger, is still around about the same sort of price. And it's my view that if one can get the market to understand this, look at the pricing from that point of view. This is a bit of a sales job for the companies that are offering these products. They have to convince people that in fact these numbers stack up, and that one should not look at it from a point of view of purchase price, but from the point of view of cents per kilometre. There's some good tools out there to do that. And that's the end of my presentation.
Thanks so much, Ben. Okay, so now I would like to invite all of our speakers onto the panel. It's really interesting to hear those different perspectives, like research, policy, and then cost and business perspective. Okay. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to ask a couple of questions to start off, and then I'll pass it over to you. So make sure you think of all of your questions. Ready to go. So I'm going to start with a question that I would like each of the panelists to give a quite quick answer for. And this is something I think that we're all wondering. Is ACT and is Australia, and ACT in particular, falling behind when it comes to a clean transport strategy? I'll start with you, Bjorn. Yes, no?
Yes.
Yes.
The answer is yes and no.
Okay, expand.
I think when we discuss about whether we are, falling behind or moving ahead, it depends on comparing to whom. I think comparing the EV capitals I just introduced, yes, we're falling behind. But if we from a global landscape to all the cities in the world, I think actually ACT has a good, Canberra has good reputations as one of the cities to transition to zero emission. And the reducing the carbon emissions, on-site emissions and embodied emissions is the challenges facing most of the cities in the world. And I believe it's not too late to take actions, and I believe Canberra can take the lead beyond the electric sector in the future.
I like that optimism. Over to you, Bea.
I think Canberra is doing very well, and that's not just in the car space or the vehicle space. Although vehicles are very well supported by not having stamp duty, by having registration waived for 2 years, which is $600 a year, that helps. Stamp duty is normally 3% of 50,000. That's these things all help quite a lot. It's also a perception thing. Canberra is also doing very well because it's hit 9% of all new vehicles sold in the small medium categories of passenger vehicles, which is the only EVs that are available. 9% of all new vehicles sold in Canberra were electric.
Okay.
That's against the rest of the country, which is much lower. So I think we're doing very well.
I'd like to hear what Bjorn and Joe have to say about those comments.
I'd love to respond. I feel that the ACT is leading Australia, and Australia has fallen behind. So when you look at active transport, we talk a big game, and we have some great facilities, but our cycling rates in particular are very, very low when you look at the cycling cities around the world, and that really, and it's plateaued for a long time, it really needs to be much, much higher. Public transport is a similar story. Our usage is actually really quite low, and it should be much, much higher, and that's probably for the ACT even lower than Australian cities. And EVs, we are definitely leading the country on EVs, and we've got great policies for EVs, but Australia has fallen so far behind on this. So I think it's probably because I'm an aspirational green, and I tend to look at somebody in the world who's doing it best. I'm like, why can't we do it like that? Hurry!
Seems like they're doing it well in Europe.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I think we have been held back by a lot of national policies that haven't helped.
So that sort of leads on to the next question I want to ask, which is something I read in the facts report. Well, actually, you presented it here as well, that we need to have 50% of our commuting trips use active for public transport in 10 years' time. How achievable is that in Canberra? Do you think it's actually going to happen?
I don't want to just be lazy, but I feel like that's also for Joe.
50% in 10 years' time is ambitious. I would love to see ambitious
Love to see
targets
it.
like
When
that.
is it going to happen?
Uh,
That's, I mean, Beyond's report says it has to happen.
Yeah, so look, what we have seen such big transformations. I will never say anything is impossible, and I think it is about us making things happen. We just flipped our entire society on its head for COVID, and our transport emissions dropped to zero virtually overnight. It's definitely possible, but we are not. I don't yet see our implementation heading in the right direction to achieve that, other than in the pure electrification of one mode of driving transport to an electric version
Which
of
is
driving transport.
That's not this, what we're
Yeah,
talking
no,
about.
so
Yeah.
the rest of it, we actually have more work to do, frankly.
Well, that's, so, yeah, when we think about Canberra, the population is expected to double, and we're expanding. So what is happening in the policy space with reining that in and making sure we have a boundary where it's actually possible to have people cycling in and increase that really sad percentage that you showed before?
Such a great question, and the next one has to be for someone else.
Okay.
In government, we have 70-30. We have an agreement with our friends in government, Labor, that 70% of our urban footprint needs, 70% of our development needs to be within our urban footprint. That still means 30% isn't. The Greens say it should be 80-20 with a view to no more urban sprawl, as in we need to at some point take the texture and draw the line and say, that's it. It's really interesting when you actually get into politics and you realise the competing pressures when people start talking about the housing affordability crisis. And every week in sittings I see how reactive governments get, because you get these motions and these pushes coming through of, oh my God, we need to build here and we need to build there because people can't afford a house. We've got to come up with a more sophisticated way of dealing with these problems that is not a quick reaction of, oh, let's just fall more. So we do have policies. I think we need more people in there who are playing the long game rather than the next election game.
Yeah.
And that might help.
Yeah. Any more comments from the panel? I'll move to my next question. So I'm interested in asking the panellists about their considerations of social equity and their work around transport planning. So could I just have a brief comment from each of the panellists about how you consider social equity and incorporate that in the work that you do? Start with Sam, if you read.
Make me last.
Okay. You
I think the social equity issues in the transport sector, I think they're typical problems because we can see, other similar problems like the accessibility of the train stations, accessibility of bike sharing points, and I think if we want to increase the equities so for everyone, I think we need to do some research and to provide some evidence-based suggestions and plans to the decision-making process. We will not be able to solve it 100% because there is a very practical barriers there, but we can do as much as we can. But we really need some on the ground, evidence-based suggestions.
Super quick comment from you, Joe.
Sure. The beautiful thing about transport is you don't have one mode of transport, you have lots and lots of different modes of transport, and it is genuinely possible to put together a package that suits everybody. So I always talk about every mode of transport, and I think that's how we deal with the equity question. But we need to do it quite consciously.
It's
otherwise
again
we-
related to this sprawl issue, isn't it?
Absolutely, because what happens is we end up with people who can only afford the cheap houses on the outskirts and can only afford the petrol cars, and then they wonder why their lives are so terrible because they can't afford their bills, and we've done that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I would say that the theme of the answers, the evening seems to be active and public transport is the kind of a missing solution to a lot of this, and one that has a lot of great co-benefits, of which equity, I think, is a large one. Now, I think much like when we talk about equity in the electricity system, there's both a part of it of like how does social inequality affect the choices that you have and options that you have in that market or that sector, and then how does that sector reinforce kind of back? Does it then continue to impoverish certain parts of the population? And if I can just have one other second, and then a much less kind of economic framing of this, there's a huge, it's not a co-benefit, but effects of particularly public transport is that it brings you together with the public and your peers. And there's something that I think is very much lost when society is split between those who sit in their own little bubbles and don't get exposure to the tradies and others who are using public transport. And I think that's a really pervasive or powerful kind of social experience.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Thanks.
Yes, you're ready?
Yes, I think autonomous vehicles is probably the answer, and I mean that across the sort of autonomous Uber concept, where you can drop the price of a trip from $10 to get a few kilometres down to literally cents, and that's going to, from a social equity point of view, enable people to get around who can't drive, don't want to drive, don't want to afford a vehicle, and one could also apply that to public transport as well. If one applies that, for example, using the sort of reserves used for trams and turns those at some point in time in the future into pods, which are autonomous, driving along this protected reserve, and going so frequently that one can actually put 10 people in a pod and the things come past every minute. That's another way of dealing with it. But I think autonomy will play a big role.
Interesting, different perspective. I'm going to ask one more question and then I'll hand over to you, so get your questions ready. Do we need to get the mics out? So you've talked about how we need to reduce our dependency on cars, and I'm wondering if EVs are this shiny, exciting new technology. I want a Tesla. I'm sure lots of people want Tesla. Probably some of you have Teslas. But if Teslas are so nice and cheap to drive, won't that encourage driving? As in, are EVs actually a distraction from this clean transport task that's ahead of us if we're just focusing on the technology side and not the really tough side, which is about urban planning and density of our population? So just a quick comment. Do you want to start with that bit?
Well,
I'll just,
yes, I think autonomy kind of covers that as well. You're reducing the cost of transport by 90% by having an autonomous vehicle pick you up and take you where you want to go and then buzz off and go to do the
you
same.
don't think it's distracting to think about, the technology solution rather than thinking about people getting out and walking or...
Well, in a
riding
sense,
bikes?
there is a risk that people might use that instead of walk or scoot. So there is a risk. Double side.
Right.
I'm always interested in the idea of car sharing. I think it's very popular in many other places in the world, and according to my observation, it's not popular in Canberra. But I think it's really, a cheaper way to reduce emissions, reduce costs, but it requires us a little bit of big changes in our established habits. And we can give it a try, but it's also have some associated risks as well. So actually, it needs some regulations to make everyone safe while we're sharing the car sharings.
Yeah.
But at least I think, we can give it a try, and it's a cheaper way.
Yeah. I lived in Germany before here, and we didn't have a car. We used car sharing, but still we had fantastic public transport and rode our bikes. So still missing that. But over to you, Joe.
That's right. I'm going to take you to a different place and talk about induced demand with the roads. And it's really well established now that if you build more roads, they fill up with more cars. It actually doesn't fix congestion. This is just evidence-based. This is known, and yet we keep duplicating more roads. So I think looking at evidence and looking at behaviour, what actually happens when you bring something in is really important, and then it is really important to actually follow through and remember that you have to actually do that thing that you said that you would do.
I don't have a huge amount to add. I think you framed it really well in terms of a distraction. I think we can kind of boil down, oh, we need to do something about transport, oh, Tesla's, all right, happy days, everyone go home, it's solved. And I think the discussion this evening has kind of really opened up how much that's not the case, how much more there is to do.
Thank you all. All right, I'll open up to the audience. You have a question up the back, and then I'll move over to this side. You first.
I just Googled it. There are 20 million cars in Australia. I think when people buy a new car, they usually sell their old car. So if we're not taking those off the road, which is a massive amount of resources being squished up or something, you're not actually improving the problem, you're just giving rich people Teslas and you sell the poor people with old cars. And I don't ever really see that part of the dialogue or conversions, which seems like.
Can I pick up on that? No, I think you're absolutely right. The question of the lifetime that a vehicle has is really challenging because it's quite long. It's decades, which means which really just amplifies the need to start making actions today. Because if we're continuing to buy $50,000 new cars that have had a lot of engineering, a lot of resources put into them, it's wasteful in all senses to scrap that in 5 years for a Tesla. That's not a good outcome for anyone. So we do need to work on kind of cleaning up, and you'll see in the facts report, it's a lot about sales targets in the first instance before you get to fleet targets. So we shouldn't be buying any more diesel buses in the ACT or anywhere in Australia, but we're still going to be running some of those diesel buses which have an even longer lifespan and more energy embodied in them for some period of time before we wreck them. So we need to be changing sales very, very quickly.
I'm pleased to say we're not going to buy any more diesel buses. We've made a commitment, no more diesel buses. I think it's a really good point. It's a bit like the get off gas plan. The cheapest and easiest way is when somebody's in the market for a new one, let's make sure they get an EV, let's make sure they get electric reverse cycle heat pump, not gas. Don't replace the old with the dirty old. And then eventually that trickles down, but it is a long time coming. We haven't quite gotten up to the conversation in our government of cash for clunkers and some of the schemes that people are talking about. We're still at that earlier stage of trying to encourage people to buy new cars that are better than petrol and diesel. But I think at some point in the next 10 years we're going to have to think about that. We have started talking through the recycling of the old ones and the batteries, and we've made some progress there.
Are all the ACT fleets now electric vehicles?
No, but we are committed to not buying any new diesel buses. We are leasing some. Our bus charging infrastructure is taking longer than it should. So we've bought a lot of e-buses, but we haven't quite flipped them all. And we are at various stages throughout the whole fleet of swapping over to EVs where there is the right thing. So we're sort of at this, in between.
Is there another quick comment?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes, please. I think what we'll see with the market is that firstly people will become less and less inclined to get a petrol vehicle once the cost issue has been sorted out. But also what's going to happen is that as electric vehicles become the most popular vehicle to buy new, what will happen with petrol diesel vehicles is their resale value will probably decline quite quickly. There'll be a kind of Kodak moment in resale value, and that will could well promote people getting out of their petrol. Let's get rid of it now, let's retire it early, I need to get into electric, because if I don't sell it this year, it'll be worth 5,000 less next year. So that might help.
Okay, question up the back.
I'm actually a Tesla owner.
I'm jealous.
And yeah, work with the Australia Institute in the climate energy team. And done a fair bit of electric vehicle advocacy, and I had a YouTube channel called Coal Miners Driving Teslas.
Which is fantastic.
Yeah, we went out to regional Queensland and took coal miners and regional people for drives in Tesla. I think it's difficult to convince people in regional Australia to take public transport or to ride their bikes. But I lived in Amsterdam as well, where 70% of people cycle, and it's amazing. And I think that we should really be doing short trips with active transport. But I also agree with Bede in that the future of autonomous driving vehicles is really exciting, and there are a lot of things that come with that, so that the utilisation of the vehicle will be much, much higher than our current utilisation. Also, the electric vehicles will be lasting a lot longer than petrol vehicles. Some of the battery packs will do 1 million kilometres, which is 4 or 5 times the amount of Ks you get out of a petrol or diesel car. But my question for Bede, and you kind of answered it just then, was that in your analysis of the cost per kilometre between petrol, diesel and electric, did you see a difference in the depreciation rates? Obviously petrol and diesel cars are depreciating dramatically, whereas electric cars aren't depreciating as fast, and actually the Model 3 Tesla, they're actually appreciating, and you're getting second-hand Model 3s on carsales.com with 50,000 kilometres on the clock for $5,000 more than the new price. And I'm wondering, and that's probably going to happen, that's going to happen for a few years yet, as demand significantly outstrips supply.
Yes.
Are fleet managers taking into account the lack of depreciation in electric
No.
vehicles?
No. In fact, the view the fleet managers have is largely driven by the risk calculated by the actuaries at the finance companies that lease electric vehicles which is part of the problem. That's why that first figure I showed you was $1,000 for the Ioniq. That's a problem caused by actuarial aversion to risk based on lack of data, and so that's the result. And we have come up with a way of removing that risk, and that's how we get the prices down. Yep.
Good to hear it's an investment, Tesla. Yeah, Elaine.
We own a non-Tesla EV. I'm very pleased about that, but we could aspire to change over eventually. One of the issues we've had is we have home charging at the moment, but we're looking at possibly going to a smaller apartment type thing where there's a public issues. There's a huge risk, I feel, for everyone we've spoken to who may be thinking the same thing about the hidden infrastructure things. I think we're talking about you can have an EV, but you need to charge it. If you charge it at home, it's fine. You know what you're doing. In a joint or a more shared infrastructure area, and it could add to things like social equity and medium density housing as well, which we're moving towards. Is there issues about what sort of charge you can get and the cabling, particularly to older buildings, but even the new apartment buildings being built in Canberra, very few of them, if any, have an EV infrastructure built in. You can buy yourself one and you can fit it up. But the other thing is the billing. The billing, no one wants to pay for someone else's EV charging in a shared setting. So the infrastructure as well as the software, which minimises and makes much more effective and efficient use of someone taking the car, an RFID or whatever car, being billed for it, and then that goes straight to the OC, the money goes straight to the OC by various more efficient ways of doing that billing. It doesn't require the OC, who doesn't know about OCs or body corporate, etc. These are the hidden barriers, and very few people, we've got a bit of time because we're refreshed and retired, but people don't have that time. And it's so difficult to find all those little hidden things that are necessary. They can either make it a good experience or a very difficult one. Have the panelists had any views on those sort of things?
I thought you might have something to say about the charging. in the apartment infrastructure, or should I go to Vic first?
Go.
Go.
Well, let me just answer that. You've probably read our product design specifications, so thank you very much for doing your homework. These are exactly the issues that need to be removed from people, that they don't have to worry about it. You know, I'm getting a car, I'm going to drive this far, what sort of charger do I need, how do I install it, what brand do I use, what electrical standards, are they safe, all of that kind of stuff. How do I make sure that if it is charged downstairs in the apartment building, that the body corporate doesn't finish up paying for it and I'm sharing my costs. All of that stuff, all done, all in those costs. So we're using software to actually manage the charging cycle as well as the costs of that charging.
Can you use an extension lead?
No. Oh, you could.
Because I've been told by Tesla you can't.
You shouldn't. What? It's not a great idea.
What's the risk?
Heat. We can chat about that afterwards.
I think now I do have a comment slash question of how much extra does it cost if I live in an apartment versus if I'm in a freestanding house under the actuator law? If you can discuss that. Because my experience is like apartments are
Because what we're doing is we're finance. I'm not speaking on behalf of ActWagio because I'm no longer, I've finished my consulting gig there, so I'm speaking as me. But because one finances the charger along with the vehicle, which commonly is not done in Australia, but the method that we've come up with is to actually integrate the charger into the finance of the vehicle, much like a tow bar would be integrated. And most finance companies don't want to do that for a whole bunch of reasons. But if one does that, it's adding a few cents per kilometre, literally just a few cents per kilometre.
Whichever time that's up. The question is, apartments in the end are halves, and it gets a little bit to the question of sale as well. We want to make sure we set up new infrastructure where properly in the first instance now, and then retrofitting either old buildings or multi-tenanted buildings is always just going to be physically hard. We're experiencing that in the project that we're doing with ActWagio, is getting into commercial buildings very, very hard. There's no way around that, unfortunately.
Can I make a quick comment on that one?
Yes.
Anyway, I'll speak on behalf of Shane Rathbury. He loves it when I do this. Shane, we're aware of the problem. Shane's delivered the first EV charging plan, and the public chargers we're going to roll out will be focused around apartment buildings like in Belconnen, around all the big towers. We're going to put a whole lot of public chargers. That's an interim solution. I own an Ionic. I want to charge it at home, so I think that's a partial fix. We've changed the planning laws, so if you go to your body corporate and ask them to make a reasonable sustainability upgrade, they have to say yes, and that will include EV chargers. It will still depend on the makeup of your apartment, whether you can get that done, and it's a bit the other thing I'll mention is I'm running an EV inquiry for the planning committee of the Legislative Assembly. We would love submissions from people about what their experience has been with an EV and what the barriers are, so write to us and tell us all about it, and we'll see if we can get something done.
You'll definitely get some submissions from here.
Great.
I'm going to go across this way, so in the purple here.
I would be interested in the panel's comments about light commercial vehicles. I noticed in yours draft that light commercial vehicles were one of the biggest and most increasing emissions. That most, for example, the ACT transport strategy is about trips to work. We've both got retired people who like commercial vehicles. It's not a big issue mostly because they're small tradies. So what are the options for thoughts that are happening to convert this part of the fleet of car vehicles?
Is that light commercial people owning an SUV, or is that light commercial delivery trucks?
I'm just using this graph, but yes, there's a lot of light commercial people who
That's
can't
not
buy a
that.
car because they've got vans.
Yeah, so you kind of need to be a bit more granular than the super high level, and you can go to the report and it gets spelled out, because the difference between a tradie versus a delivery, still the difference between a tradie and a delivery van is huge. In terms of like physical makeup of the vehicle, but more how that vehicle is used. So horses for horses in that case.
Let's go to here in the front.
Test if this works. Right. There was an article published. Okay. There was an article published in Conversation on the 8th of April 2022. And The article was called "What Would It Take to Get Little Australians to Buy Electric Cars?" Canberra provides guidance. Now my question is not so much about ACT, but we spent a lot of time talking about that, but rather about Australia and the federal government. Because from this study, they looked into electric car usage in Australia and discovered that nationally only 23,000.011% of the 20 million vehicles registered in 2019 were electric. What can we do to set up the circumstances correctly that we could adopt EVs at a national level in mass? And I'm thinking not specific example here, but something we didn't do with electric with ICE cars, that we had to set fuel standards, and therefore, as a result, absence of fuel standards, we've had little motivation to change the type of cars ICE cars are using. The questions for EVs.
I'm happy to
Start with you, Vic.
1.1 million new vehicles are sold in Australia every year, and we have something approaching 20 million vehicles on the road. We're not going to, turn 20 million vehicles and scrap them tomorrow. We can't get EVs to replace them. A whole bunch of reasons. There are Jeeps in the country. Those will come in the next year or two. Vans are here, but not yet at the sort of level where they're going to be economic. These things will all emerge over the next couple of years, and it really is that we can't scrap what we've got. What we've got to do is we've got to evolve over to that. The arrival of quality utes will have a major impact, especially if they've got that V2G capability, because then traders can use that power tools and things like that. So I don't think we can have a revolution. We have to wait for an evolution. But the faster we can accelerate the start of that evolution and get, Sweden, for example, went from 5% of all new vehicles sold as electric vehicles in 2019. In 2021, they exceeded 50% of all new vehicles sold. So it's possible to go from 5 to 50% in 2 years. Sweden's done it. Can we replicate that? I'm sure we can.
Let's hope. Go to the side. Zach.
Hi, my question is for Dr. Pang. About your study in Shanghai. Did you think that did you see any reduction in people using personal use cars as well, or active modes of travel? Were there other things that people were using, and was there generally like a reduction in car ownership, or was it a direct substitution?
Yeah, this is very good questions. Because as I just said, every city is different. In terms of Shanghai, it's a city with a growing population and with a growing car ownership, which means most households started to own their first cars. And in our research, we found that because of the policy incentives, so many first car owners, they chose EV over the petrol cars. So this can avoid future locking emissions as one side. The other side is because Shanghai is a mega city, there are car ownership control policies there. So they support the public transport and also combined with other like the bikes and electric scooters. So yeah, I think Shanghai is a mega city, has some typical challenges facing so many mega cities in the world.
Good question. Igor.
So my question to all members of panels. You know that electric vehicle is as green as electricity used to drive. Probably less green because it needs to be battery vehicle. So from this point of view, when our green electricity is not 100% renewable, should we really push electric vehicle, or we need to push renewable electricity and make sure that electric vehicle development follow development of renewable electricity?
I'll start with Sam first.
Happy to jump in on that. I think everything that I've read is that even with current Australian electricity grid, with its levels of renewables that it has, it's still greener to have an electric vehicle than a petrol vehicle or an ICE vehicle. I think it's the theme of the facts report is we need to do everything. We do different things at different paces and at different times, but I think we need to keep electrifying and decarbonising our electricity system as quickly as you possibly can. while trying to electrify as much of our other roads as we can as well. I think that's a false binary to say one or the other.
I think I might move on because there are a lot of questions up here in the grate. Yep.
Is local manufacturing going to be the answer to the supply problem, and is there any reason why we're not doing it?
Yes and no. That sounds like a marvellous idea. Yeah, look, we've had a change in federal government. I think we've got a lot of interest in restoring Australia's local manufacturing, and I think local manufacturing and local circularity and recycling is going to be a really good way to control the environmental impacts of that and control the human impacts of that, and I think we should definitely do more of that. We don't really have that kind of industry in Canberra, so it's not really a lot that we've looked at an ACT level, but I think as a nation, great time.
In the middle here.
Two things. Joe, I heard you say that there's not a lot of take-up of actual continuing activity and active travel, but I see the popularity of young people getting on these scooters, and they seem to take it on back to work. So we'd like to comment on that. And the other issue I want to raise is I haven't had a full drive, and I'd like to travel around the country as many Australians do. I saw a news article that said that Angus Taylor had been rolling out some charges around the country, but mainly around the coasts, but not inland. Although I also know that WA is now rolling out charges all the way up the coastal highway, right up into the Pilbara area. So, I know there's EV four-wheel drives, which currently have something like a 300-kilometre range, and I have seen a Birdsville, a concept vehicle which actually cost us in some desert with a little tiny capacity.
Great questions. Maybe the scooter one to use.
Yeah, e-scooters are awesome. They're so much fun. If you haven't tried one, you should definitely try one. I think that's great. I think I'm wildly impatient, so I probably expect us to do better quicker. Active travel overall is still a low mode share, and it's like our recycling. We did a great job, but it's sort of plateaued for a long time, which tells me not that we're setting the wrong targets, but that we're not putting enough resources into driving it up. So we definitely need to do that. But e-scooters have been an instant success once we got past the big whips of the line. So go young people. Go everybody.
And any comment about the charging infrastructure for four-wheel drives?
No, just commented on it's really the automotive associations that have been doing a great job, I see, in kind of putting charging into that next inside layer of the onion of the highways that go through Wagga, etc. So the NRMAs and RACVs of the world.
I think we've got time for one more quick question. Is there anyone who's had their hand up for ages?
Thank you. I'm a lot of questions, people like us, especially in public transport. One of the stats that stuck in us, not over this decade, series of presentations, was on the conversion of people using light rail from private transport to light rail. And I think of all the stats I saw there, that's probably consistent with back of the buck in an ACT strategy. Do you think that there's potential here for maybe more focus on rolling out clean energy public transport, for example, instead of F1 drive upgrade, light rail along F1 drive? And if we can't convert the diesel fleet because of the charging challenges for the ACT bus fleet, maybe hydrogen, hybrid, the solutions. I'm interested in the panel's views on those sort of questions.
I'm going to start. I'm going to be really excited. We managed to get Celia to give us money for light rail, so I'm pretty sure we're going to do better now. So I'm very interested in making sure we don't waste ACT money and get as much federal funding for things like that as much as possible. I probably won't weigh in on the hydrogen. That's better for somebody else here.
Happy to talk about hydrogen. I don't think hydrogen is necessary in the ACT. Generally speaking, buses in large metropolitans like Melbourne can get around just fine. Toby, Roxborough, the president of the AIE, who was unfortunately not able to make it today, was responsible for deploying buses across Auckland, which is not a small city, and he electrified the whole of Auckland with buses. It's quite possible to have electric buses.
I just raised that because there's 440 buses in the ACT fleet. I think we've got 4 electric vehicles in the ACT fleet. We've got challenges electrifying the depots to charge the 90 buses we aspire to procure. Perhaps if we look at the lifetime of the bus, which is 20 to 30 years, is there some option to either use hydrogen or get a hybrid hydrogen EV fleet in the time it takes to get us there?
The short answer is yes.
30 years more diesel buses is a long time.
It is entirely possible to do that. Whether it's as economic is probably the issue. And the electric
whether or not it's any easier. I think the challenges around charging electric buses are entirely symmetrical. Like entirely symmetrical. So really, that should not be saying that we're waiting 30 years on, we should be waiting 3 years for that. Like, you go, you buy the things, and you essentially, and then you have some grid integration challenges for Marty and I to play with, but essentially, that's like very, very symmetrical.
Thank you, Bjorn. So I know there are more questions and we've run out of time for those, but hopefully the panellists are hanging around for a little while, so you can feel free to ask those questions of the panellists after we wrap up. Before we wrap up, I would like to invite each of the panellists to give a very short 30-second summary of your final thoughts and any points you didn't get to make so far. So do you want to start, Yuan?
Yes, I think we're just at the beginning of the transition towards EV use, so hopefully everyone can get on board and contribute in different ways.
Jared,
transport's really interesting because we actually need everybody to help, as opposed to electricity where the government just did it for you. So we've got big opportunities and big challenges. It's going to be a fun ride.
That's a good way to look at it.
Maybe take home message is this concept of trying to avoid trips before we try and shift trips to active and public transport, and only then are we looking at trying to improve the technologies that we use for private trips.
Great. Final thoughts?
Yes, EVs are affordable.
Okay, let's finish up there. So I would like to thank all of our speakers very much. Very, very interesting talks and comments, answering questions. And I'd also like to thank you very much, audience, for attending today. I'd like to thank the organisers, especially Renee. I would like to remind you that there is a recording of this event available soon on the ICED's YouTube channel. And can you please complete the evaluation form that will be sent to you? That's really helpful for us. And I would also like to invite you all to join us for refreshments out in the foyer, which is happening right now. These refreshments are provided by the sponsor, ACTU AGL. So thank you very much. Please join me in thanking the students.